Something was wrong on the coastline. The fishermen noticed it first. A shape in the distance, pale as driftwood, moving slowly along the rocks near the water's edge. At first, they thought it might be a dog, or a piece of ice catching the light in a strange way. But as they watched, the shape grew larger, and the unmistakable outline of something powerful and ancient emerged from the morning haze. None of them had ever seen anything like it in person. Not here. Not in this part of the world. It was a polar bear. Alone. Far from everything it had ever known. The men stood and stared. Nobody spoke for a moment, because beyond the shock of what they were seeing, something else was immediately apparent. The animal was not moving the way a healthy wild predator moves. There was no confidence in its stride, no territorial alertness, none of the quiet authority that an apex predator carries even when it is not hunting. This animal was moving like something that had already lost a long battle and had not yet accepted the outcome. Nobody knew how it had gotten there. Nobody knew how long it had been traveling. And in those first few minutes on the shore, with the pale shape growing slowly clearer through the haze, nobody could have guessed what kind of story they were standing at the beginning of. The village of Timlat sits on the eastern edge of Kamchatka, a remote stretch of Russian peninsula where the land juts out into the cold Pacific and the nearest city feels like a rumor from another world. It is a place where people know the wilderness well, where bears and eagles and sea creatures are part of daily life. But polar bears do not live in Kamchatka. Their world is the frozen north, the sea ice, the vast white silence of the Arctic. The nearest polar bear habitat was nearly 700 kilometers away. So when word spread through the village that one had appeared on the shore, the reaction was immediate and complicated. There was wonder. There was fear. And for those who looked closely enough at the animal as it moved along the bank, there was something else too. There was pity. Because this bear was not threatening anyone. This bear was not prowling or hunting or displaying the confident strength of a healthy wild predator. This bear was limping. Its front paw was held close to its body at an angle that made several of the older villagers wince just looking at it. The fur was matted and dull. The animal moved with the heavy resignation of a creature that had been through something terrible and had not yet decided whether it was going to survive. How it had arrived here was a question that wildlife officials would piece together in the days that followed, slowly and carefully. The way you reconstruct something fragile from broken pieces. Somewhere far to the north, weeks or perhaps months earlier, a young male polar bear had been doing what polar bears do: hunting, moving across the sea ice in search of seals, following the frozen pathways that connect the Arctic hunting grounds. It was ordinary bear behavior, routine, the kind of thing that had been happening in those frozen waters for thousands of years. And then the ice broke. Not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic moment, but the way it sometimes does in the changing seasons. A floe detaches from the mainland pack. The gap between ice and shore widens by centimeters, then meters, then more. The bear would have sensed something was wrong, would have turned and tested the edge, would have looked at the dark water between itself and solid ground, and understood, in whatever way animals understand these things, that it could not cross. So it stayed on the ice, and the ice kept drifting. Days passed. The ice carried him south and east, far beyond any territory he recognized, far beyond any scent or landmark that might have guided him home. At some point, he must have entered the water, because there was no other way for him to have reached the Kamchatka shore. And somewhere in that journey, something had happened to his paw. by the time he dragged himself onto the rocky beach near Timlet. He had traveled roughly 700 kilometers from where he belonged. He was exhausted, injured, and starving. The landscape around him offered none of the food he knew how to find. There were no seals beneath the ice here. The terrain was unfamiliar. The smells were wrong. Even the quality of the air was different, warmer and stranger than anything his instincts had prepared him for. He wandered the outskirts of the village for a while. The sounds of human activity reached him, voices and machinery and the ordinary noise of people living their lives, and his instincts told him to stay back. But this bear was not in his territory. He was not an apex predator right now. He was a lost and hungry animal in pain, and whatever drove him forward through those final hours was something more desperate than hunger alone. He found the police station the way animals sometimes find the places they need. Not by reasoning, not by plan, but by some combination of exhaustion and instinct that brought him, step by slow step, to the one place in the village where help was most likely to arrive. He lay down outside the building and waited. The officers who responded to the call kept their distance at first, which was entirely reasonable. A polar bear, even a weakened one, is an enormous and potentially lethal animal. The claws alone were enough to demand serious caution. But as the two officers moved carefully around the bear, watching it watch them back with those dark, patient eyes, it became clear that the animal was not preparing to charge. It was not displaying aggression or distress in any threatening way. It was simply lying there, its injured paw pressed against its body, looking at them with an expression that the officers would later struggle to describe in their reports, but that both of them would privately describe the same way to their families that evening. The bear looked like it was asking for help. Wildlife officials arrived within hours. The injury to the front paw was confirmed as serious. The kind of wound that left untreated in the wild could mean slow starvation for an animal that depends on its strength and speed to hunt. They treated the wound as carefully as they could, and cleaned it, dressed it, and made sure the animal could rest. And then they gave him a name. Someone in the village suggested Umka, after the beloved polar bear from a classic Russian animated film. A small white bear, lost and searching for his way in a world too big for him. The name fit so naturally that it stopped being a suggestion almost immediately and became simply what he was called. Umka. The name spread through the village within hours, and once it did, something shifted in the way people related to the animal outside the police station. He was no longer just a problem to be solved. He was Umka, and Umka, as far as the people of Timlat were concerned, was their responsibility now. The days that followed had a quality that was difficult to explain to anyone who was not there. The village organized itself around the bear with the quiet efficiency of a community that had decided, collectively and without much formal discussion, that this animal mattered. Residents brought fish every morning, carrying it down and leaving it within reach while keeping a respectful distance. Children pressed against the barriers the officers had established, watching with wide eyes as Umka ate or slept or simply sat with his gaze pointed somewhere beyond the rooftops. Older residents came and stood quietly for long minutes, not taking photographs, not speaking, just watching. Word traveled outward from Timlat the way news does in connected times, faster than anyone expected and further than anyone anticipated. Visitors came from surrounding communities to see the bear for themselves. Journalists arrived. Wildlife officials from the regional capital made the journey. For 8 days, a remote Kamchatka village became the center of something much larger than itself, all because a young polar bear had needed somewhere to lie down. Through all of it, Umka endured. He ate enough to maintain his strength. His paw began to heal under the care of the wildlife team, but observers noted something in his behavior that was harder to address than a physical injury. He would stand sometimes near the edge of the monitored area and look north, holding that posture for long stretches, testing the air with his nose in the slow, methodical way of an animal searching for something specific. He was not restless exactly. He was oriented, pointed towards something he could not reach. He wanted to go home. The officials managing the situation understood this clearly, and they also understood something else. The journey home was not something Umka could make on his own. 700 kilometers through unsuitable terrain, in a weakening condition, with no prey and no landmarks he recognized, the math of that journey led nowhere good. Wildlife consultant Alexander Selnitsin stated the situation plainly. Without intervention, survival was unlikely. The question was not whether to help. The question was how. A road transport was immediately ruled out. The terrain between Timlat and the Arctic was not traversable by any vehicle that could safely carry a polar bear, and the stress of that kind of journey on a recovering animal would likely cause more damage than it solved. The only realistic option was the one that had, as far as anyone could determine, never actually been attempted before. They would fly him home. The request traveled up through regional government with unusual speed. The governor's office contacted the emergency minister directly. A helicopter was authorized. A transport cage was commissioned and built to specifications that could safely contain an adult male polar bear who might, at any point during the journey, wake up and decide he disagreed with the arrangement. That last concern was not theoretical. It was the scenario that the entire crew would be quietly thinking about from the moment they lifted off. On the morning of the flight, 8 days after Umka had first appeared on the beach, a wildlife veterinarian administered a sedative, carefully calibrated to keep the bear safely unconscious for the duration of the journey. Umka was loaded into the cage with the focused efficiency of a team that had rehearsed every step. The Mi-8 helicopter lifted off from the landing zone outside the village as the residents of Timlat gathered to watch. Many held their phones up. Others simply stood quietly, watching the helicopter rise until it was small against the sky and then gone. The flight north was long and loud. Helicopter cabins are not quiet environments. The rotor noise, the vibration, the constant mechanical presence filled the space and saturated everything. The crew maintained their posts and monitored their instruments and tried not to think about what was enclosed in the cage behind them. And then, somewhere over the Kamchatka wilderness, with hundreds of kilometers still to go, a sound came from the cage. Movement. Shifting weight. The unmistakable sound of a large animal returning to consciousness. The crew went still. Nobody moved suddenly. Nobody raised their voice. The sedative had metabolized faster than calculated. Or perhaps the stress of the environment had worked against it in some way the veterinarians would analyze later. Either way, the result was the same. Umka was awake. He was inside the cage. He was surrounded by the noise of the helicopter and the unfamiliar smell of fuel and metal and human beings. And there was nothing between him and the hull of the aircraft except the bars of the transport enclosure. The next several minutes would determine whether this rescue mission ended in success or in something that nobody wanted to think about. Umka shifted in the cage. He oriented himself, taking stock of his surroundings with that methodical animal attention that can look like calm to a human observer, even when it is not. The crew watched him. He watched them back. The helicopter kept flying north, and the noise kept filling the cabin, and nobody breathed more deeply than they had to. And then Umka settled. He lay down in the cage. He kept his eyes open, watching the crew with a steady attention that one of the members would later describe as somehow not frightened, not threatening, just present, just waiting. A government spokesperson who spoke to the press afterward kept it simple. The bear was scared, they said, but he stayed calm. He was a brave bear. The helicopter landed in the Northern Territory that wildlife officials had identified as suitable release habitat. The crew went through the final procedures carefully, confirming the site, running through every step one last time. And then someone walked to the cage and opened the door. Umka did not rush out. He stood in the opening for a moment, filling his lungs slowly. Cold air. Arctic air. The smell of ice and open space, and the particular quality of wind that he had been born into and had spent weeks being carried away from. Something in his posture changed. The exhaustion and the wariness and the long weight of displacement seemed to lift slightly, the way a held breath releases. Then he ran. Not in panic, not chaotically, but with the powerful, purposeful stride of an animal that suddenly knows exactly where it is and what to do next. He crossed the ground in long bounds and disappeared into the white distance. The crew stood beside their helicopter and watched until there was nothing left to see but open tundra and pale sky. The mission was over. After everything, after the broken ice and the impossible journey and the days of waiting in a village that had no reason to care for him but did anyway, Umka was home. Umka was one of the lucky ones. But for polar bears across the Arctic, the story does not always end with a rescue flight and an open door. Today, roughly 26,000 polar bears remain in the wild, distributed across 20 distinct populations throughout the Arctic, according to the IUCN Polar Bear Specialist Group, whose most recent status report was published in October 2024. Several of those populations are in serious decline. In the western Hudson Bay region, one of the most closely studied populations on Earth, the number of bears dropped by approximately 50% over a 40-year period from 1979 to 2021, a decline that researchers at the University of Toronto directly linked to sea ice loss caused by climate change. In the southern Beaufort Sea, aerial surveys showed the population fell by roughly 40% in just 10 years. NASA data shows that Arctic sea ice in September is shrinking at a rate of 12.2% per decade. The ice that polar bears depend on for hunting, for travel, and for survival is disappearing faster than these animals can adapt. And as Umka's story showed, when the ice breaks, bears can end up far from everything they know, with no way home on their own. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps us keep telling the stories that matter.